Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of the Better Places for People webinars as part of World Green Building Week. You've joined us today for a discussion around creating a healthy and green indoor environment. It's a pleasure to have so many of you with us today, and we hope that you'll enjoy contributing throughout the session. If you have questions for our speakers, then please do write them directly in the chat box, and we'll pick these up throughout the session. Or if you have comments to share with the wider world, then please do tweet us. Please use the hashtags you can see on screen, hashtag Better Places for People, World Green Building 2018, and say hello to us at WorldGBC. So the structure of our session today will include a short introduction from me, and then we'll be handing straight over to our 5 speakers for today's session, who will give us a brief insight into each of their areas of expertise, before we open up into a wider discussion including audience question and answer. So to start the introductions, I'm Catriona Brady, Head of Better Places for People, which is one of the global projects of the World Green Building Council. The World Green Building Council are a global network consisting of over 70 national green building councils. Our membership totals around 50,000 individuals and organisations, and we engage our membership around achieving green buildings for everyone, everywhere. Now, Better Places for People is one of our global projects aimed at increasing the demand and supply of green buildings, which are supportive of the health, well-being and productivity of the people within them. Now, we know that the health and well-being trend has been growing massively in the built environment industry across the world. And Better Places for People exists to support our GBCs and the wider industry in working to make buildings truly sustainable. And by that, we mean good for people and planet. And one of the big questions that we face when we're talking about sustainability on such a global scale is, how do we do it? And specifically, how do we make it relevant to my project based wherever I am in the world? In today's session, we're going to start to unpick these big questions by hearing from some of the most influential organisations in the sustainability world. So our question for discussion today is, how do we create a green and healthy indoor environment? And I'm delighted to be joined by a range of expert panellists to help us unpick our question for discussion. So firstly, we'll hear from Piers MacNaughton, who's speaking to us today from Boston, USA, and representing the Harvard School of Public Health. Piers is a research fellow at Harvard who has been instrumental in implementing the COG-FX studies around air quality in work environments, which are now in their 3rd iteration. Piers is going to open the presentations today by talking to us about the 9 foundations of a healthy building. Secondly, we'll hear from Thijs Maartens, who represents Cradle to Cradle and is speaking to us from the Netherlands. Thijs is an expert on sustainability within the materials industry, with a particular expertise around circular economy. He's going to bring an insight into the materials world for our panel discussion and explore the challenge of how building materials can be green and healthy, as well as discuss some solutions. We'll hear next from Peter Foldberg from Velux, who I work very closely with as a global sponsor of Better Places for People. Peter is based in Denmark and has over a decade of experience working across the Daylight Energy and Indoor Climate Department. Velux release a fantastic research piece each year around health and well-being in Europe, called the Healthy Homes Barometer, of which the 2018 release is being published next week. Peter is going to share some of the key findings from the Healthy Home Barometer research around how we can make our homes both green and healthy, which is fantastically on theme with this year's World Green Building Week topic of green homes. Next, we're joined by Lindsey Malcolm, also speaking to us from London. Lindsey is an associate at XCO2, a sustainability consultancy headquartered in London. Lindsey leads one of the environmental teams at XCO2 and has technical expertise in many of the components of green and healthy indoor environments that we'll talk about today, including air quality, thermal comfort, and daylighting. Lindsey brings a technical industry background to our panel, and I look forward to his presentation around some case study examples of implementing these principles in real-life projects. Finally, Slavomir Shapunar is the International Marketing Director of the Saint-Gobain Group, based in Paris. Slavomir hails from Krakow in Poland and has a background in lecturing before joining Saint-Gobain. Saint-Gobain are also a global project sponsor of Better Places for People, and they champion healthy and green indoor environments through their multi-comfort design approach, which I look forward to hearing more about to close the panelist presentations today. So please do pose any questions you have for our panelists in the chat box throughout the session, as well as joining the conversation on Twitter. After each presentation, I will ask our panelists a quick question, but after all the panelists have presented, we will have a dedicated discussion and Q&A session for 20 minutes or so to close the webinar. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over to our first speaker. Piers, over to you.
Thanks, Catriona, and thanks for the introduction. So I'm hoping to use this going first as my opportunity to introduce healthy and green buildings more broadly and present the 9 foundations of healthy building, which is a framework that we've developed here at Harvard to kind of put a holistic framing on the impact of the built environment on people's health and well-being. And one thing that I think we've noticed in our research is that while we focus on many different types of indoor environments, we have programs on schools, on homes, on airplanes, office environments, and within those different environments, we looked at many different types of exposures and components of the built environment that can impact people's health and well-being. What we found is that when we started to share some of these findings with our partners and building practitioners around the world, that they often can get lost in the complexity or even just the fact that we focus so specifically on specific factors when we start thinking about research in these environments. So for one example, I've done a lot of work looking at the impact of ventilation on people's cognitive function. So when we go to our partners and share some of these findings, a lot of times the conclusion they take away is that ventilation is really the one thing they need to focus on. So we found that in our experience, we need to take a step back when we start sharing the impacts of what we're finding from our research and giving a more holistic view of why the built environment is important for health beyond these individual factors that we looked at. So early on, as we created our 4Health program, we developed what we call these 9 foundations of a healthy building, which are the complete set of factors in the built environment that are important for health. And the goal of creating this body of evidence was to start to put together how there's more than just any one particular factor is important. You really have to consider the complexity of the built environment and consider all these factors together in unison. So this has been put together as a report that our team has put together. It's available on our website, 4health.org. And so you can go and download it. But what we did when we first compiled these set of foundations was to compile all the evidence there is to date on each of these factors, and then try to really put together and synthesize the research that's been done and put it into just a simple 2-page document that can help boil it down into more digestible content. So each of these, if you go into it for each of the foundations, we have a really short 2-page summary about why each one's important, how it impacts health, how it impacts cognitive function. And so it's supposed to be really a digestible document, but at the same time, we still have all the citations back to the primary literature. So if you want to dig in deeper, you certainly can. I think within this panel, we're very lucky to have some of the practitioners that are doing the work that's important for this. And so I think later in the panel, we'll have Deluxe comment a bit about how lighting is important and ventilation is important, how you can actually optimize these in the built environment. I think we'll have, sorry, I had myself there. We'll have CO2 talking a bit about air quality and thermal health conditions in the environment. And lastly, we'll have Cradle to Cradle talking about how chemicals and products in the space can influence both air quality, dust quality, and water quality. So I think within the building and the built environment, there's a lot to be said from these panelists in terms of what they can do from a practical standpoint. How can you actually optimize these conditions in the built environment? But one other thing that I want to open up to the panelists and for us to think about over the course of this webinar is really the business case behind these types of exposures. So let me just advance the slide here 1 second. Seems to be a little stuck. There we go. So the other aspect of green and healthy environments, besides just the impact on health, is that there's a business case to that. And how do we actually encourage people to pursue these healthy building factors and pursue green buildings? And when the green building movement first started, I think that it primarily was grounded on the energy performance of these green buildings and how if you can improve your energy performance, you can save on your energy bill. So that's what spurred the beginning of the green building movement. Within the first several years, as these buildings started to become more popular and more prevalent, there became evidence that there was a market performance increase in these environments, that people were willing to pay more to work in these environments, pay more to live in these environments. And as that evidence became more apparent, I think that helped the green building movement accelerate and to expand beyond the initial set of buildings that just had that kind of energy focus initially. And so as this evidence became present, we saw an acceleration of green building movement and really expanding both globally and urban and rurally as well. So for the first decade or 15 years of the green building movement, that seemed to be enough to motivate a lot of innovation, a lot of expansion of these green building standards. But in recent years, I think there's been a little bit of a stagnancy, or at least a plateauing of the adoption of some of these standards, as the people that saw the benefit of the market performance, energy performance, had gone that route already. And if you look at the green building movement in its current state right now, it's somewhere between, depending on where you are in the world, 2 to 5% of buildings, of existing buildings, are certified green, and of new ones, it's about 40%, maybe 50% that are pursuing certification of some type. So while there has been great market penetration, it hasn't gone all the way to all buildings, which is where we ultimately need to go. So some of the more recent evidence that's been coming out has been focusing more on the occupant, and a lot of the research that our team has done has focused explicitly on that and trying to say, not only does this building perform better from an energy perspective, but the people inside that space is also going to perform better. And there's a real market performance in the fact that you can optimize people's productivity, you can optimize their health and wellness, you can make them happier in their environments, more willing to work there. And this, I think, is helping even motivate people towards green and healthy environments, even more so in the last couple of years. And then lastly, the last piece of the puzzle that I think is just now emerging is that these buildings, by the fact that they have low energy consumption, they rely less on the combustion of fossil fuels, is that they are intrinsically linked to ambient air pollution, which has a very large societal burden as well. So there are concrete health benefits to society at large by the fact that you have buildings consuming so much energy. And if you can improve upon that, then certainly there are ways to improve the health of society as a whole. So I'll open that up as the frame for some of the other panelists to comment. I think there are two avenues that are certainly very interesting. One is that in the built environment, we have all these factors and these foundations that are important for health. And there's lots of applications about how we can improve the indoor environment for health. And then lastly is the business case. How do we actually motivate people to pursue these types of strategies and to move towards these green and healthy environments? So with that, I'll pass it over to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Piers. And the 9 foundations document that you presented looks fantastic, and we can definitely share that on social media after so that our audience can pick that up and give it a more thorough read themselves. But I've got a quick question for you, Piers, before we hand over.
Sure.
We've got a few developers and building professionals on the line, And we've talked about these 9 foundations. So, pressure question for you here. But do you think any of the 9 foundations are most important for our building industry professionals to be prioritizing?
I think the priorities have to come from whether it's developers or architects or designers. I think the interest varies a lot on one, the type of environment you're making. Is it an office environment or a home environment? In offices, people might care more about how productive they are. At home, they might care more about how well they sleep or these chronic exposures to chemicals. And so your own priorities are going to inform a lot about which of these different foundations is important. If you care about productivity, there's very strong evidence around ventilation, and lighting, and noise. If you care about these more long-term exposures, then it might be exposures to chemicals and dust or air quality. So that, I think you have to approach it from the perspective of your own priorities, and then you can dig into the evidence to figure out which of the foundations from your perspective is the most important. But overarching, I think what we are hoping to convey is that you can't just necessarily focus on one in isolation. They're so intrinsically linked that you need to have a more holistic approach in general.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Piers. Okay, so let's hand over to our second panelist now. Thijs, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Catriona. Very happy to be speaking here today. I hope you can all hear me well. So just to maybe create the bridge between the previous presentation by Piers and ourselves. So Cradle to Cradle Certified is really about verifying healthy circular inputs, really the inputs and the materials that flow within a circular economy. And our vision is really to create a prosperous economy where safe materials are intelligently cycled, and then, most importantly, are manufactured in ways that positively impact people and planet. And people here are central, and I think also are central to the topic that we are discussing here today. So if we look into the standard that we have to verify products, trying to switch slides, see if that works. Perhaps you can help me. Wonderful. You can click again and again. Thanks. So what we want to create is this regenerative economy, right? A circular economy that is regenerative. And that means to us it's greening a healthy and safe economy as well. So if we talk about recycling of materials for circularity, we want to talk about safe materials that are both safe for humans and the environment. And as a second, then we start to talk about materials that can be biologically or technically cyclable. But the precondition really is that these materials are safe and unharmful to humans and the environment. We don't want to create a toxic society of recycling. That's not a very sort of progressive thought. We might have been already doing that. So the circular economy, again, is about safe materials as a foundational building block. And that's also where I think we feed into this discussion, is that if we want to create healthy buildings at the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute, we take the position that healthy circular materials are foundational to be able to do so. And of course, one of the foundations, but definitely foundational. And in doing so, of course, we also want to eliminate the concept of waste. And waste can take many forms, as we will discuss a little later. I'm trying to click through, but if you can again assist me. Yeah, please move on. So the way we do this is looking really at the design of materials and at how these materials are produced. So we are a multi-attribute assessment and certification program, which looks at both the design and at the production of these materials. Material health from this perspective is really a core tenet of our certification program, which really looks at what materials go into a product, and are these materials hazardous? How are we exposed to those materials? Are there any problems there? So again, you see how that relates to potential risks, health risks, productivity risks, etc. in the full building layout. Other design attributes are the material reutilization. So how can these healthy materials then be reused? And of course, we also want to do that with respect to water, use as much renewable energy as possible, and where possible, go beyond the baseline of local regulation regarding social fairness. In the next slides, I will talk a little bit about the problems we are addressing with this layout. So as you see, we want to make sure through our program that we have just safe materials out there that can be perpetually cycled without any problems. And if we talk about healthy materials and we talk about the problems that we are addressing there, I think what some of us don't realize that every day chemicals of concern are used to make products. And of course, there are efforts to curb these hazardous chemicals. But overall, we can say there's a lack of regulation and adequate testing protocols. As an example, we are based in the US, and only 5 chemical substances have been banned in the US since 1990, just to illustrate that. And more than 82,000 registered chemicals are in commerce today. Just to give a look at this is the top of the iceberg, and I know that Harvard and their public health school are doing a lot of very interesting research on that as well. So in other words, we don't know a lot about the hazards associated with a lot of the chemicals in our homes or offices. We simply, in a lot of instances, don't know what's in our products, let alone what the exposure risks are of these products that we are around. And that's a risk, and that's a problem we're trying to solve for together. So again, as a foundation, looking at these healthy materials. If you can go to the next slide again, please. Thanks. So if we look at health, if we look at nature as a regenerative system, there is no concept of waste, right? So in essence, there's also no issues with health. Materials are reutilized in safe cycles, and there's no persistent or bioaccumulated materials that can lead to irreversible changes. That's definitely not the case for the products that we generically produce. According to a study by the World Bank, for instance, already in 2012, we create 1.3 billion tons of municipal waste every year. And these volumes, they increase very quickly, even faster than the rate of urbanization. We know that poorly managed waste has enormous impacts on human health and local and global environments, and even our economy. That's something we can go into at a later stage as well. At the same time, we also need to understand that if we talk about the built environment here, that 35 or 40%, depending on the study you use, comes from the built environment. So we have a big responsibility here, and we need to solve for that problem. Next slide, please. Thanks. And of course, there's also carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases involved in the production of a lot of materials. A 2014 report published by the European Commission documented that the top 4 regions contributing to carbon dioxide emissions from manufacturing, from the manufacturing sector are China, the United States, the European Union, and India. I mean, greenhouse gas emissions from industry primarily involve fossil fuels burned on-site at facilities for energy, but may also include emissions from chemicals, and that's what we talk about today. Let's do the next slide, please. I want to also just talk a little, and then I'll hand it over quickly about water. So water and human health are very closely interlinked. Less than 3% of the water on our planet is fresh water, and about 2.5% of that of the total amount is frozen. So we basically only have 0.5% of all water on our planet that is usable. If, for instance, we would fit all the water on our world in a gallon jug, the amount of accessible fresh water we can use and live off would fit into a tablespoon. I think these visualizations help us to understand how and what our impact is at the moment, and how we can see this as a challenge in terms of the effect that this water reserve could have on our human health. Next slide, please. So when we talk about water, just the previous one, please. When we talk about water, and given that it's such a scarce resource, it's quite astonishing that 22% of fresh water is used or contaminated by the industry, and some 300 to 500 million tons of heavy metals, solvents, toxic sludge, and other sorts of waste are accumulated each year in these waters. Again, what we are trying to say here is that designing products that are healthy for humans also could have a very positive sort of trickle-down effect on the broader environment. And this is a systemic problem that we need to solve in order to create a regenerative economy. So if we go to our last slide, all I want to say about this slide is the following, is that although it almost seems as everything we humans do causes harm, we do have an opportunity here to design out the concept of waste from a very broad perspective. And because everything is connected, and sometimes it's not always obvious who is responsible for what, I think I want to make an appeal here for you to start acting now, and at least for and within your building project, start asking the right questions about what chemicals of concern are in my products, and how can I start designing these things out at the building level through specifying healthy materials actively. I think that's my contribution for now. So Catriona, I would like to hand it back over to you, if that's okay.
Thank you, Thijs. That was great. And those images are really quite powerful as well. Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, I'm sure. Quick question from me, and this is something that I know I personally have a great interest about, and I'm sure that I am reflecting the opinions of lots of people on this webinar, but there's a lot of talk these days at the moment about embodied carbon. So materials which have a low carbon footprint from creation, even before you put them into a building. But is there a relationship between buildings being lower embodied carbon and maybe greener, also being healthier and less pollutant for the world and for building occupants?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is a relation, obviously. What I like to stress here is that we need to make a distinction between designing and being very sort of efficient in designing out past problems, or solving for past problems, and then designing, on the other hand, for a positive future. And if we look at embodied carbon, of course, it's a very relevant issue if we look at creating more efficiencies and creating more efficient products over the whole. But if we want to look at creating 100% positive impact, at some point, if we do well, that might become less relevant in terms of the impact that we will have in terms of the energy, the amount of renewable energy that we will use, etc. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Yep, Thijs, thank you so much. Let's hand over now to Peter from Velux.
Thanks a lot, Catriona, and thanks, Piers and Thijs, for very interesting presentations. What I will do is to dive deeper into the topic of healthy residential buildings. So creating healthy and green indoor environments is something that has been at the DNA for our company in Velux for decades. So for us, this is a very, very important topic. We have a lot of experience with this, and Some of the things we believe is that legislation must promote healthy indoor environments, and we would also like to work to make it as simple as possible to design healthy buildings. What I'll do is I'll share with you two pieces of work that is related to these aspects. So the first one is the Healthy Homes Barometer. As you mentioned, Catriona, we are bringing out a new edition of the Healthy Homes Barometer next week. So you'll find that online from next Wednesday. But already the 2017 edition had some findings which are quite relevant to this discussion. Those are based on Eurostat's SILP database and based on a correlation between the health of the building's habitats and the building state. The SILP database is very broad. It's run every year by Eurostat based on questionnaires to 250,000 adults across Europe. So it's very rich material. It addresses a series of aspects of unhealthy buildings. One is inadequate heating, another is dampness. It asks about overheating problems, lack of daylight, and leakages. So those are the topics that the Healthy Homes Barometer is diving into and correlating to the health of the occupants. Let's see if I can change slide here. Yeah. So I'll jump right into some of the main conclusions. What you see here on the slide are the correlations between the general health as perceived by the occupants and their building status. And to the left, we see that almost twice as many Europeans report poor health when they're living in a damp home. So when you are living in a damp home, and then the risk of also having poor health is actually almost twice as high as if you're living in a non-damp home. Looking at the lack of daylight, it's almost as high. So 1.5 times as many Europeans that report poor health when living report poor health when they're living in a dark home. We've also just completed analyzing results from the variables related to overheating, and we see a similar trend here that almost twice as many report poor health when they're living in an overheated home. So there's no doubt that there seems to be a relation here between the status of the European buildings and the health of the European buildings. I would expect this to be not just a European phenomena, but actually a global phenomena. But the Eurostat database naturally happens to be based on European homes. Another finding from the Healthy Homes Barometer is on the relation between damp or moldy homes and asthma. This is a global correlation based on a large meta-analysis made by Fraunhofer IBP in Germany, who have analyzed, made a meta-analysis of more than 200 studies on the relation between dampness and home, and find that you are more than, approximately 40% more likely to have asthma when you're living in a damp or moldy home. So this is a quite significant number, of course. Then I'd like to go to another piece of work. It's a publication. It's actually a book on designing healthy homes. It's called A Good Indoor Environment Feels Like Being Outside on a Mild Summer's Day. So it's meant as a guide to designing healthy homes. It has a lot of content, a lot of tips and guidance into to specifically how to design healthy homes. I'll not be able to cover all of that. I'll just make a few glimpses into the content and follow up on Piers' lead on this. One of the things that is important to know is that daylight has several important impacts on our health. It drives our circadian rhythm, which means that the light has more than just a visual impact on us as human beings. which is important to be aware of when designing homes. Then we have looked a lot into the correlation between, say, well-daylit homes and the risk of overheating. We have seen that the technology called ventilated cooling is very efficient at mitigating overheating. Ventilated cooling is essentially the use of natural ventilation in a design where the building is designed for use of natural ventilation, and potentially also where automation is used to maximize the benefits of the natural ventilation. Ventilated cooling is efficient, especially if it's used also during the night to cool down the building, so that the building is cool during the day. It allows the building to start at say during the morning of a warm day to have a temperature which is perhaps 21, 22, 23 degrees. And then as the outdoor temperature rises, demonstration buildings have actually demonstrated that you can maintain an indoor temperature that remains lower than the outdoor temperature as it rises during the day. The investigations of the comfort of occupants that we've seen shows that occupants find this a comfortable house to live in then. It's in this way a sustainable alternative to air conditioning. And what's interesting is that there seems to be actually no link between overheating and the amount of daylight in homes. When the homes are well designed with use of solar shading and natural ventilation, and these are automated, then it seems to be possible to actually build houses with a lot of daylight without getting overheating. And that brings me to the last of the slides from the Healthy Homes guidelines. They're related to automation. And what we see is that with the energy efficient buildings we have today, which reacts very strongly to direct sunlight, then the benefits and the importance of automation is increasing. So to achieve sustainable homes in the future, given that we need to maintain a very low heating use during winter, it is probably going to be more widespread to use automation to control the indoor climate throughout the year, and especially during the summer, where windows and solar shading can be automated with good benefits. So those were the last slides from me. Back to you, Catriona.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. And I have to say, I love the title of that book. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Now, a quick question for you. Now, we obviously have a global audience. We're speaking in a World Green Building Council webinar. And some of the ventilation strategies that you've recommended rely on natural ventilation. So how do you recommend adapting these strategies if you live in an urban area with really high pollution?
Well, I think there are a few things to say to that. Naturally, the most important here is to try to reach a situation where there is actually cleaner outdoor air, allowing us to use natural ventilation, also be outside without harming our health. But this is not really the key today, especially not in many places in Asia and other places. So one of the things that you can actually use is to use automation again. If you are automating your natural ventilation, then you can make sure that you're ventilating your home at night, and perhaps also at other times of day when outdoor pollution might be a little bit lower than at other times, even though that it might not change that much during the day, but that is one of the things that you can do. And then it's also interesting to follow the developments in the technology of air cleaning that might be becoming more widespread beyond the use in Asia, where it's already being used quite a lot. So air cleaning could be a good combination with natural ventilation.
Thanks, that's definitely a good answer, because I'm sure we could talk about that for another whole webinar.
Absolutely.
But thank you very much, Peter. I will hand over now to Lindsey from XCO2.
Thanks, Catriona, and thanks everybody. Some really interesting stuff so far. So continuing with the real world application of some of these principles, I wanted to share with everybody some case study learnings for some recent work we've been doing with a regular client of ours, looking at getting a balance between buildings that are both green from an energy performance perspective, but also healthy, and in particular with relation to the occupant comfort. The projects we've been working on for this client are primarily cafes, but the principles would apply for many sort of small, regularly occupied spaces like offices or retail units or other food and beverage environments. So the first step for us with this client, they have a number of properties, and one of their challenges they found was that they were getting feedback from both staff and customers about discomfort within the spaces. Their conventional design approach is very much on the basis that they're given a building and they fit out the services and systems. It's quite a standard design they use, that they map from location to location. And the way that they've sized their systems historically was very much about the total load in the building. So looking at full occupancy, looking at gains from outside, gains from inside, and as a total saying this is how much cooling we need to provide to maintain comfort in this space. Now the challenge with that is that you end up with a big picture perspective, looking at the whole space as a single environment, but not picking up on the local variance within it. So as you can see in the little plan we've got on the right of the slide there's a big seating area that takes up most of the unit, a small area next to the counter where people queue to pick up their drinks, and the darker red area is the counter where the staff are working, but also where a lot of the internal games are. And what they found is that feedback from the staff quite regularly was that they were too hot and they weren't comfortable in the space, and that the occupants, the guests, the visitors, were complaining that they were too cold. And the problem with this is that when people aren't comfortable, they don't have a tendency to stay in the space, and so people were coming in and leaving quite quickly. So we worked with the designers and we worked to look at the performance in the space and came up with some suggestions on how they could change the layout and strategy. And in particular, looking at moving the location of some of the cooling systems and changing the way they were controlled so that there was a provision both for the staff within their own space, but also a separate provision for the customers. And so when the staff were hot, they could turn on a system, but when the customers were not hot, they weren't getting cooled unintentionally. And this segregation allowed for a split and an improved comfort for both the staff and the customers. Moving on from this, we continue to work with the client as they rolled out their first zero carbon concept. Now this was a standalone coffee shop, and they had full control over the design of the building, which meant they could look at the passive approaches around things such as natural ventilation and solar shading. They could look at the daylight levels and have a big focus on the thermal comfort. And the big driver for this, as their first concept, was about being zero carbon. And so they put in a lot of technology in terms of sort of controls and sensors and actuators to try and drive the comfort within the space and minimize the energy use. The one challenge that we found with this when we went in once the store was operational was that there was actually a perceived loss of control in terms of the internal comfort for the space, because the space was being treated as a single volume, which meant that when the temperature within the space got above a certain level, windows would open on the facade and windows would open at roof level to let airflow through. But it meant that people sat next to the windows would get colder than those within the middle of the store. And the responsiveness of the systems the staff found was quite slow as well. So we did an extended post-occupancy evaluation, working with the staff and with the developer to look at what they might do in terms of the way the systems were controlled and commissioned, how they could get a balance of sensitivity so they could start to bring some fresh air in, but not just open the windows fully wide, and how they could pick up on the differing needs for the occupants within the space, whether it's the staff or whether it's the customers, and how seating within different areas in the unit would work. So these learnings were fed into the next generation, and this is property that's now open, and we're currently working with the client on the third generation to go beyond this. But what we found is the key thing was to try and get a balance from a passive and an energy perspective. So things like shading and the draft lobby on the doorway and the sort of the openable windows were all very useful to deal with the big ticket items and the big issues around sort of the climate effect, and could be controlled in a sensible manner to help make the building low energy. But there was a need for a level of control and responsiveness in the system, which meant that we were looking at introducing some systems in local areas, such as for the staff, and having flexibility to change how the system performs. So looking at changing temperature set points so people could change when they wanted the cooling to come on, looking at having a level of control for the staff and for the occupants as separate things, and very much trying to get this balance between passive and active systems within the space. And whilst this made it a slightly more challenging prospect from an energy perspective, it did give us a much greater level of control and performance from a comfort perspective, just highlighting the need to try and balance the two elements. We are still working with the client, looking at how the building is delivering its performance and operation, and very much find that with both green buildings and with healthy buildings, the commissioning and the monitoring of the systems is key, and making sure people who are in the space understand how it works. So we've worked with the staff to sort of educate them and to help them get an understanding so they can communicate that to the customers as well. And so to sort of share our key lessons learned really from this experience, when we're looking at buildings that are trying to be green from an energy perspective, but also healthy from a comfort perspective, it's very much about understanding the occupants' needs and thinking about how they're going to use the space and what they need to get out of it, and using the operational requirements that come from that to drive the design and construction, making sure that the design is clever so it can pick up and get a balance between the drivers that come from a health perspective and a green perspective. And ultimately, we find that we end up with buildings that are actually delivering a tangible value for the operators. So customers are staying there longer, the staff are happier, there's greater staff retention. And so the turnover for the business is much higher and much more profitable as a result. And I think that's it for me, although I've lost control of the slides, sorry.
Thank you, Lindsey. That was great. It's so interesting for us, I think, to see one of your headline findings as green and healthy has tangible value for the operators. And after that presentation, we can definitely see how that works in a retail environment. But in your experience, do you find that owners and occupiers see these green and healthy co-benefits across other building types, like offices or homes or schools?
I think so, yes. I think there is definitely a balance for spaces to be healthy and to be green, and there is value in achieving that. But it's often only in the situation where at a design or construction stage, you know who the building occupants are going to be. Because so much of this, whether it's about health and well-being or whether it's about low carbon and green performance, so much of it is related to the use of the building and the way the spaces are controlled and operated. So if you know who your residents are going to be, or if you can engage with the teachers who are going to move into the school, or the building occupants for an office, or even the facilities management teams, then you can understand their needs and you can help educate them and ensure that they can get both benefits from healthy, well-built buildings and from green buildings.
Great, thank you. Okay, last but not least, it's a pleasure to hand over to Slavomir from Saint-Gobain. Slavomir, yes. Over to you.
Thank you, Catriona. Thank you for the introduction and all the speakers before. It was truly interesting. Just a few words at the start in the introduction of the Saint-Gobain, who we are. So more than 350 years of history in construction business, and for the last 7 years consecutively one of the top 100 innovators. So we are usually looking at ourselves as the young company with a lot of experience. And our key role is to help the other stakeholders, and the slides, to help other stakeholders in the construction business to create great living places and improve daily life, simply by providing, designing, manufacturing, and distributing material and solutions that combine comfort and sustainability. And the true embodiment of this approach is our multi-comfort program, which starts from the end user perspective. So depending on the type of the building and the purpose of the building, together with our building science team, based on the works like 9 foundations that we have heard about it, today we have created a set of criteria that needs to be fulfilled in order to satisfy what we are calling the 4 sensorial comforts. But then, depending on the building location, we have available solutions for the building envelope and its performance. And there is a number of sustainability dimensions like the energy and carbon, material and resources, and health and safety, which with our solution we can impact directly, and some of them which we impacting indirectly, and they are like the recommendation more than criteria. And at the end of this process comes the assessment, which for us needs to have 3 dimensions. First of all, it should be done by the recognized third party. Secondly, it needs to refer to the building as a whole. And thirdly, and probably most important, it needs to take into consideration the whole lifetime scale of the building existence, because it only in this way it does make sense. So setting this up a couple of years ago, we've started to think what would be the best way to promote it. And since then, we start to get involved in the number of different size of projects in more than 18 countries all over the world. And the idea here was to really get into what one may call the type of the ordinary buildings anyone can build, whether it's in the residential or non-residential sector. Each one of them tells the story of the journey which allowed to reach optimum comfort level in sustainable way and create therefore the multi-comfort reference. And you could find some details about it on our multicomfort.com. I would like to focus today on one of the most recent examples, which is our own building, the North American headquarters we have in Malvern, Pennsylvania, which has been opened just 3 years ago. And the reason why I have chosen this one is that this is the example of a renovation project, and we all know that it's kind of more challenging than the standard one. And this is the office space, so the building built for purpose, where we could clearly evaluate the increase of productivity and people evaluation of this space. So the original building was designed in the 70s, and from 2006 stood empty. We took it over and decided to create a great living place and converted it into the 85,000 of square meters dedicated in 1/4 in the workstations and then created more than 100 collaborative spaces and all the supporting functions like cafeterias, dining areas, fitness centers. And for this work, which was based on more than 60-hour systems and solutions, the building has been LEED Platinum certified, LEED version 3 for commercial interiors and core and shell. Why it might be interesting is that since the very beginning, we have treated this as the living laboratory. So we wanted to really understand for ourselves and prove to the world that it does make sense to do this sort of buildings. So we have engaged to do the 4 waves of testing prior to move and renovation in the old location where we were and the new location, post-renovation but prior to occupancy, and then post-occupancy after 1 year and after 2 years. We've used for the help of the University of Oregon High Performance Environments Lab, and we were assessing 3 components: the building envelope performance in terms of the hard measurements and data, employees' evaluation of comfort using the Space Performance Evaluation Questionnaires, so-called SPEC, and then what we call the hard indicators, which some examples from the Green Building Report you have, like, for example, 50% increase of qualified applicants per job opening, or increase or double efficiency in the lead per call in our call center. So in doing all this, obviously, the most important is the perception of our employees. And in the most recently published report that summarizes of this and is available on the livinglaboratory.com, we are publishing the findings of it. So a true appreciation of the indoor air quality and improved impact on health of the inhabitants, the great appreciation of the visual comfort. It is to say that the old workstation has the daylight provision, and 93 has the provision of the good view to the outside, improvement of the acoustics in the collaborative spaces and the open space. And we had some challenges related to the thermal comfort due to some limitations the renovation projects put on us, but which we tried to address and create. So I would like to finish with a little bit of a personal note. And I've seen a lot of green buildings, healthy buildings, and so on. One thing that is truly striking in this is the connection to the outside and the ability to enjoy the beautiful environment. And this has been enjoyed not only by our employees, more than 800 of them working them every day, but also to the visitors who have visited this place. And I just want to share with you that over the last 2 years, we had more than 25,000 people visiting these premises from all over the world, trying to learn how to combine these different products and solutions into the great places to work. So our message here is that in alignment with everything that has been said before, we try to help with the multi-comfort approach to simply truly create in a physical sense of this world the great places to live, learn, or work. Thank you.
Thank you, Slavomir. It's really interesting for us to see you reflect on the benefit to your own organisation. It's a really nice case study for us to look at. So, quick question to you before we turn over to questions for all of our panellists. But do you have any advice that you would give to occupiers listening to this session about how they can undertake this kind of in-house health and wellbeing research in their own organisation?
Well, I think that the key starting point is that for those who are not considering the comfort and the well-being as a value in itself, we have a lot of proofs and the scientific studies and the case studies like the one showed by me, where we can demonstrate the actual ability to monetize the impact of the more comfortable and healthier building environments. So this is the first one. And the second one is really to start from the end user inhabitant desires and needs analysis in order to be able to shape the space in the most appropriate way, taking into consideration the good balance between this visual, thermal, acoustic, and indoor air quality comforts, and balancing it according to the purpose the building was built for.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we now have the opportunity to open up for questions and discussion. And I apologise, we're running a little bit behind schedule. So for people who do need to duck out now, that's absolutely fine. But we'll run for about 5 minutes more just to answer a couple of questions with all of our panellists together. So thank you so much, firstly, to our 5 panellists for such interesting and varied presentations. So let's start with a couple of quick questions. And firstly, let's let's go back to the key principles that Piers presented in the first session. And we've had a lot of pre-submitted questions and a couple in the chat box as well about air quality, which has been particularly newsworthy in recent months and was also a big focus at last week's Global Climate Action Summit. So opening up to all of our panelists now, maybe Piers would like to start here, but what strategies can we use to improve the air quality within our homes and offices to make them green and healthy?
Yeah, I'll start in on that one. So I think one of the dirty secret about outdoor air pollution is that we're exposed to most of it indoors, that because we spend 90% of our time indoors, even though some of the air pollution from outside is removed indoors compared to outdoors, the fact that we spend so much time indoors leads to our exposure being greater inside than outside. And so it's extremely important to think about how can we reduce our exposures inside, considering that that's where we spend most of our time. And there are certainly a lot of solutions, and I'll let some of the others on the call chime in on those as well. But the other aspect of this is that buildings themselves contribute significantly to the air pollution that we're exposed to. They contribute to 40% of primary energy production. And so there's a really large impact of buildings in terms of the demand on the grid, and then also in terms of the air pollution that comes from that. And we've done a lot of work that's trying to reframe that conversation and saying, you know, if we start with you know, the current status of what buildings are doing, and we look at what green buildings can do, we can show that if you reduce your energy consumption in buildings, that you actually can have a benefit by reducing air pollution and having health co-benefits from that by the fact that you're reducing fossil fuel production that has to be generated for that. So there's two aspects to it. There's one, buildings are important for mitigating our exposure to air pollution, but they're also extremely important in terms of the fact that they themselves contribute to air pollution.
I think that's quite a good point, actually, talking about how the buildings are contributing as well as actually trying to deal with the issues around air pollution. I think for all of us, the challenge is really about how we deal with air quality throughout the cities as a whole, and then using that to sort of drive the improvements internally. I just wanted to share with people some interesting stuff that's starting to come through here in London now, being driven by policy, is around looking at making buildings and new developments air quality positive. So the idea that the spaces we're creating should improve the air quality internally and in the local area around them, just as a result of their being there. And that's something that's going to pose some interesting challenges, I think, for us as designers in the next few years.
Okay. And I think that if we would just narrow down the question into the indoor air quality, as we are spending 90% of our time indoors, then I think that there are just three basic rules, which are simply don't bring the bad things home, meaning that just make sure that the materials and products that you are creating, your living or working environment, is not emitting any VOCs and bad polluting particles. Then the second one is simply ventilate according to the rates that are advised and with the right amount of fresh air for everyone, and the important filtering system. And last but not least, to the last comment, purify wherever possible. So there is a range of products that can actually scavenge what we have as the VOCs in the indoor air, and actively purify this from these particles.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to jump back in here just to twist the focus a little bit and ask about the role of nature and biophilia, which, as we know, can be integral in improving air quality within a space if you have enough plants or enough green space in your surroundings. But we've had a number of questions in the chat box about biophilia, and a lot of them have been asking, should nature be a part of a healthy building? And should it even be, Piers, one of your 9 foundations?
Sure, I think it is one of our 9 foundations. We have one of them is lighting and views, and so a big component of biophilic design is views of nature, and then also within the space, access and views of natural elements within the space, whether that's real, plants and natural elements, or if it's natural analogs, so patterns and biomorphic forms. Certainly, it's really important, and our team thinks it is, certainly. So I hope that didn't seem like an omission from our 9 foundations. We have a biophilic program that we're running here within our team. We're doing a lot of really cool research using virtual reality to simulate biophilic exposures. So we're having participants come into our studies, we have them enter a virtual reality environment, and then we expose them to different environments that are exactly the same, except that we can change the levels of biophilic design within those spaces and even tease apart individual patterns. So is it more the long distance views that are important, or is it the actual having plants in the space or the biomorphic forms? And we can start to tease apart the individual patterns that are important for influencing people's health. At the same time, we can start to track their physiology and their stress response while they're in that environment. So we're hoping to have some findings on that very soon. So I don't have anything to share at the moment, but soon we should be able to share some findings on that.
There's no doubt that access to having a view of greenery outside your building and through windows has a regenerative effect on your health. As you mentioned, Piers, it's also interesting to see that some new standards on buildings actually also have definitions on how to categorize the view outside, which just underlines that there is some scientific foundation and that this is becoming increasingly important in building design.
Yeah, and just adding to this entire spectrum of view, right, and maybe broadening it a little bit from the perspective of cradle to cradle and looking at our direct environment as a natural system, I think we have a responsibility to take nature as our inspiration and start asking questions like, where do the products that we are around with come from, and where do they go afterwards? So, as I mentioned, in a natural system, we know that waste is a nutrient for next life. How does that reflect upon the products that we are around with? I think it's a very good sort of starting point to ask very critical questions to your direct suppliers and partners in your building projects to use nature as inspiration and thereby get some answers to the questions around where does stuff come from and where does it go after use. I think those can be very helpful sort of insights, just plainly based on natural systems.
I completely agree with you, Thijs. And thank you everyone for sharing those opinions. Now, just as one last quick question, I'm going to ask each of our panelists for a 1-sentence response to one of our most important questions we've had pre-submitted, which is, how do we engage our developers and our built environment practitioners in pushing their green and healthy agenda beyond just what they have to do for policy requirements?
I guess I'll start. I'd say because it's marketable, that there is a value proposition behind healthy environments. We spend 90% of the money on buildings on the people inside them. So even a small change in how those people feel or perform will vastly outweigh whatever the energy costs are or the operational costs are about making those spaces green and healthy. So there's a value proposition, and that's being shown by the fact that we have, even on this panel, so many companies that are providing really great services in this domain, and there's clearly a lot of demand for them. So I would say that's the main thing, that it's marketable, and that the organizations that are in the front are the ones that are adopting these strategies right now, but over time, I'm sure they'll become more and more prevalent.
I think from my side,
oh,
go on, sorry.
No, I wanted to lean into this comment real quick, is that in addition to it being marketable, which I think is the most important message we want to be sharing here, we need to think from a marketable perspective that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, right? We don't know what this will bring us. We don't know all the details yet, but what we can quantify is so super interesting that the whole of the parts that we're now bringing together with these 9 foundations and with the perspectives that you heard today are going to be like this is an investment. This is an investment that has huge potential, and brings us to spaces that we were not able to imagine before. So just adding that in terms of this is even bigger than what we can currently quantify in terms of marketability and impact. This is something that is that is really interesting.
Thanks, Thijs. Just a quick sentence from our last three. Lindsey?
Yeah, I think from my side, the key thing is that it's driven by demand from occupants. So all of us on this call should be asking this of our buildings and our designers and our developers.
Great. Peter?
Well, I think it's clear that voluntary labels on green and healthy buildings are actually already in demand in the market, and I mean they have the power to change how we build buildings. And then a fact that we've also seen through studies that developers and investors should know is that well, healthy buildings are actually rated more valuable by customers, and homes that are healthy do sell faster. So there's a lot of you could say commercial arguments also for going this way.
Thank you. And Slavomir, last but not least.
Yeah, I think that on top of these things that have already been said, I would add the extra one that the best help would also be to provide the tools that will allow them to sell what is invisible. So if you are speaking about the improvement of the acoustic comfort or the thermal comfort and so on, how are we capable of demonstrating it to the future tenants and owners that it will really be the case, and what are the consequences of the different choices that we may say. And nowadays with the virtual reality, but not only, the capacity to modelize all the flows and behaviors, it's really something that should be used more widely in order to argument for the better solutions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so thank you all so much to our great speakers from today's session. Piers, Thijs, Peter, Lindsey and Slavomir, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who've attended and those of you who have watched our recording back. I hope you found it a valuable and enjoyable session. Before you go, please can you participate in our audience poll if that's okay? Give us some feedback if you've got anything to say. And don't forget, we've got 2 more Better Places for People webinars to go. Next week, we have the second in our webinar series called A Healthy Approach to Certification. And our sponsors, Velux, are also running 2 great webinars around green and healthy buildings next Monday and Friday. So please do join me for those as well. You can find details on all those sessions through the World Green Building Council website and through our social media channels as well. So thank you very much again to all of our speakers and attendees, and wishing you all a great day.